Why, hello there, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages. My name is Mr. Dogboat333 and welcome back to the Tino Development Diary number 30. Now, last time we were here, we went over the previous diary, part 1. This is part 2. If you've not seen part 1, go ahead and check out the playlist that I will try to remind myself to put in. If not, just hop in my channel, look from there, or if you're too lazy, if you want to come back later, harass me in the comments, I'll post it in the description box. That was essentially a lore dump for the Great Depression into the start and the end of World War II for the United States. We're picking up at the signing of the ceasefire. And this is going to take us from the ceasefire up until the start of the TNO start date in 1962. So, let's go ahead and get to it. I should set my... I'm not timing this, per se. I'll start my stopwatch, rather. Keep track of how long I've been going. Defeat. A novel concept in American military history proved challenging to grapple with. Some believe the Dewey administration could have won the war in time, especially with public disclosure of the Manhattan Project in 1946, but hadn't had the guts to continue sacrificing lives and material required for victory. Others considered American involvement in the war a mistake in itself. Still more remained indifferent to the war's handling, but bemoaned poor execution and strategic decisions. Decisions to scar the British countryside with defoliants, incendiary devices, and potent chemical agents did little to stop the German advance, but instead alienated the British population and made a long-term war untenable. An uncompromising choice to empower General Douglas MacArthur allowed for gains on the island of Papua, but these came at the expense of China, Burma, and India, further contributing to not only his permanent discrediting, but also that of nearly the entire wartime military leadership. The views of the war were varied and oftentimes in conflict with one another. All agreed that the blame lay squarely at the feet of Thomas Dewey, his generals, and the Republican Party. Facing political obliteration in the upcoming cycles, Dewey did what Dewey remained of his cabinet, scrambled to salvage American pride abroad. The opportunity came in the rapidly disintegrating USSR, whose devolution to chaos gave the president a chance to intervene and reassert his and the United States authority. Unlike the 1919-era American deployment to Russia, however, the intervention in Siberia sought to stabilize the embattled Soviet rump government, now led by former secret police leader Genrikh Yagoda. The port of Magadan, Western forces worked side by side with Soviet communists to maintain order, prevent famine, and facilitate the relocation of thousands of Soviet bureaucrats and intellectuals fleeing their war-torn homeland. Through the Democratic Congress's Operation Paperclip, this expertise would prove instrumental to furthering American science and technology. At the same time, the combined effort of the remaining allied nations in Siberia strengthened the military bonds with one another, preserving the fractured United Nations at a time when disintegration felt likely. That's clever. I do like the flip. If I'm not mistaken, I'm going to make sure. Operation Paperclip. In our timeline, when the Germans collapsed, the Americans swept in to secure former Nazi scientists and put them into American scientific positionings. The Soviets did this too a little bit. Some people throw this an example of Americans being uniquely bad. The Soviets would do it too, usually a lot more forcibly, from my understanding. But hey, it got us NASA, it got us on the moon. So, you know, take it as you will. This is all very interesting, re-editing, reshaping of things. We also get led to one of the additional laws of Burns-Eaton Resolution of 1946. Surrounded on both sides by the Empire of a Rising Sun and the German Empire, Eagle. The United States society cannot idly sit by to wait for Congress to decide when and if the president could take needed action in self-defense. It needed robust action. As the Siberian campaign became a fiasco, President Dewey intervened by unilaterally deploying troops to the former Soviet Union. Although the move was not explicitly illegal and shifted executive power norms, Congress soon developed a consensus solution to retroactively justify it. The Burns-Eaton Resolution of 1946 empowered the Commander-in-Chief to deploy troops without a declaration of war or act of Congress. providing the president with enough leeway to defend the interests of the United States without getting bogged down by bureaucratic processes. Very interesting. I'm not quite sure if it's like Patriot Act inspired. I haven't looked at the Patriot Act in a while, so I forget what exactly it does. But, arguably pretty necessary for the TNO timeline for us to be able to intervene in all these special conflicts. So, interesting. Interesting addition there. In the end, however, Dewey's hopes in Siberia were met with the same frustrations as his other endeavors. The Russian intervention was neither enough to prevent a democratic avalanche at the 46 midterms, nor was it a quick foreign adventure as the president had a vision. Yagoda's Soviet government proved unable to sustain itself, and American involvement could only increase in response. Though Allied commitment to the region never rose above a few thousand boots on the ground, the intractable conflict and persistent skirmishes with Japan-backed anti-government forces led the media to dub the intervention as the Siberian War, cleaving open a point of division between the internationalist troops of the establishment majority and the smoldering parties of the isolationist minority that would persist well after the end of Dewey's administration. The crushing weight of the Democratic supermajorities in the House and Senate left the final years of Dewey's presidency as the lamest of all lame ducks. With his executive power limited to foreign affairs, his vetoes ineffective, until defeat in 1948 seen as a foregone conclusion, the president became the unwilling figurehead of an aggressive Democratic agenda. While the White House and Congress could agree on some things, such as continued support for Soviet government in Siberia, Dewey was ultimately the junior partner in his government. This unhappy marriage culminated in the Long-Range Planning Act of 1947, which pushed past the New Deal programs of Roosevelt and officially inserted the federal government into the nation's economic development via the Long-Range Planning Office under the Department of Commerce. Republican protestations over the act's infringement on private commerce went unheeded by the Democratic supermajorities, as did Dewey's veto. The reality of depression and the war had left its impression on American politics, and done were the days of an unregulated national economy. So here's the Long-Range Planning Act. Amid the U.S.'s loss in the aftermath of the Second World War, a new Democratic majority emerged to finish the dream of the New Deal, despite fierce opposition from President Dewey. The Long-Range Planning Act of 47 passed despite a veto, established the Long-Range Planning Department to oversee the national development of civilian projects to maintain federal employment and fuel economic development internally. Congress has made further additions to the act in ensuing years. During the Eisenhower administration, the department was placed under the authority of the Secretary of Commerce. So Thomas Dewey has to be one of the worst presidents in the TNO timeline, right? Who outworsts him? Buchanan, maybe. Andrew Johnson. Strange hypothetical to kind of debate internally. Roosevelt, FDR loses a lot of his prestige, I think, as well. He has a legacy, but that's largely built on past his administration. The court packing thing kind of ruins his multiple terms. Interesting to muse about. Meanwhile, let's go ahead and check this out. If there are any highlight of Dewey's final 2 years in office, it came in the admission of Alaska and Hawaii as the 49th and 50th states. Alaska, frigid and enormous outpost on the edge of a continent dominated by military bases, left-wing Russian immigrants, and native Alaskans. And Hawaii, a corporate-owned island paradise, balance one another out as Democratic and Republican bastions, respectively. Even though this, however, was not free of trouble, Hawaii in particular stood as an avatar of class and racial struggles between the white-dominated Big Five corporations and the multi-ethnic unions attempting to break hold on the state's economy and politics. Accusations and denials of communist and pro-spear sentiments within the unions and their ethnically Japanese members fueled a pressure cooker of tension that, in an act of divine mercy, did not burst during the last months of Dewey's doomed tenure. God, yeah. Poor Dewey. He just can't get it right, can he? Whether pundits knew this at the time or not, the otherwise uncompetitive 1948 presidential election would become a turning point in American history, remaking both parties behind the scenes. Within the GOP, heavyweight Eastern establishment figures collectively decided to punt on the nomination choosing to save his strength for a more favorable cycle in the future. However, by abdicating the halls of power in the party, these moderates left a vacuum for whoever was angry and ambitious enough to harness the seething mass of Republican partisans, humiliated by Dewey's impotent second term. Instead of a meek, sacrificial lamb, party leaders were horrified as Mr. Republican, Senator Robert Taft, overran meager establishment forces on a hardline anti-intervention, anti-New Deal, anti-Dewey platform, while defending his role in the Dewey administration's disastrous war effort. This event marked the end of the moderate dominance within the Republican halls of power and cemented activist conservatives as powerful forces within the party. In contrast to the bereft Republican field, the race for the Republican nomination in 48 was among the most competitive in history. Amid the jockeying and arguing between the innumerable candidates, Senators Claude Pepper and Strom Thurmond came together to pursue what many Democrats considered a fantasy, drafting Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower, the most popular man in America, to the Democratic ticket. Even as the Pacific Theater crumbled, Eisenhower commanded the Allied forces with distinction in Europe. His leadership under pressure and a string of successes in the dying days of the war made him a living legend among the American public. And indeed, his staunchest supporters were quick to declare that Ike would have won the war entirely had the Republicans not lost their nerve for the cause. Nobody seemed more qualified to helm the ship of state in a new and uncertain world than the general who fought the Axis to a standstill. Even with the reluctant Eisenhower requiring a draft movement to enter the race, Democrats soon turned out in droves for the man they hoped would be their next Roosevelt. Never mind that he was not a Democrat. Soon, candidates cleared the field, and Eisenhower's July 1940 coronation sealed his crash course with a victory over Taft. It soon became clear that the Eisenhower campaign had no intention of engaging with a contender as hopeless as Taft. Instead, Ike eschewed the day's issues in favor of personal appeal. Running on a platform of base incompetence and undefined change from Dewey's failure, the Democratic nominee greatly benefited because Americans, by and large, had no conception of his actual politics. Northerners saw the general as a malleable figure who could deliver on lost potential of a New Deal and controversial civil rights plank adopted of the Democratic Convention. Eisenhower no comment. Southerners considered him as a principled moderate who would serve to block Northern liberals from destroying their way of life, while liberals, satisfied with the plank, despite their chosen candidate's non-committal, accepted compromise as an easy solution. Even disaffected isolationist Republicans could figure Ike as a crusader against fascism abroad, as opposed to the isolationist Taft. For his part, Eisenhower opted not to dispel any of his disparate supporters' dreams, shying away from political promises or even attacks on his enormously popular commander-in-chief, and instead sticking to platitudes about democracy, fairness, and hope. Analysts predicted a Republican decimation in November and effectively stopped covering the race. In doing so, they would miss the true mark of the Taft campaign, even as the Eisenhower tide crushed the GOP. Taft had sown the seeds, set the table, and provided the organizational spark for a generation of radical and conservative activists to follow him. Follow him into the pits of despair right now. Just Hawaii and Vermont. Everything else going Eisenhower. That is brutal. My God. I'm surprised even in 48, Hawaii going blue. I guess if they suppress the Japanese vote there, then fine. But even then, man. Not even Maine going Republican. That's brutal for the Republicans. So here's a ticket. Dwight Eisenhower. We all know Ike. We like Ike. What's not to like? And then Scott Lucas, looked him up, former majority leader for the Democrats, senator from Illinois. Not a very effective one, from what I gathered. And then Robert Taft, quote-unquote Mr. Republican, hardcore isolationist. He was in that one TNO mod that had MLK lynchable. Do you guys know? Not the campaign trail mod. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? Identity War. I mentioned that because right next to him is the guy from Red, which was basically the mod with the same concept, just way better. Harold Stassen, liberal governor from Minnesota, continual perennial candidate. He was running against Reagan in '84. It was very, very funny. I'm kind of sad, but we have the peak of his political relevance in TNO, I assume. Unless they decide to throw Stassen in as a candidate, which, TNO devs, if you're watching, please do. That would be very, very funny. I don't know if we need a reminder of the red situation, but we could just look past that. Anywho, I realize if you don't know what that was with the campaign trail mod with the MLK thing, I sound completely unhinged there. Let's just move on and try to ignore it then. Eisenhower's inauguration broke records for crowd sizes. Americans from across the country swarmed to D.C., cheering as a wartime hero took office and restored democratic dominance over the country. To do so, many Americans, whether dissatisfied with war performance, the erosion of a New Deal, or in general need a boost to a low national morale, Eisenhower appeared like George Washington, exuding dignity and purpose for a humiliating lost nation. With supermajorities in Congress, the Supreme Court, and the arena of public opinion, Ike held the power to reshape the United States with a sweep of his hand. And indeed, many Democratic partisans fantasized that he would practically erase his sting of failure through overwhelming force. These dreams, however, ignore the reality that Eisenhower never promised nor intended that sort of sweeping change that most of his fervent supporters imagined. Instead, liberals around the country watched in horror as the general sat on his hands, only rolling back Dewey policy in limited cases, repurchasing TVA dams from private ownership, rebuilding highways, and generally refusing to expand the role of government any further. The greatest political mandate of a generation was bestowed upon a man who had no interest in using it, and as such, the Democratic project idled with the world in its hands. Despite this, the late Democratic project under the new administration had given considerable damage to the excesses of capitalism and furnished the United States with more technocratic, corporatized economy that retained much of the war-era economic mobilization, now geared towards the civilian economy. Gone were the eras of Great Depressions, as Democrats used planning to keep the ship sailing no matter what. So this is the new American economy, American corporatism. While some may have expected the American economy to revert to a more free market-style capitalism, the U.S. of A. has become hardened to the realities of the Great Depression and Second World War. Throughout the American economy, the once combative relationship between labor and capital has been forged into something new. American corporatism, founded from the New Deal State Planning Board, has since evolved and found its place across the land. The vested interests of the capital or labor will no longer dominate one over the other. The U.S. government now works as a referee on all sides, mediating and holding back any strife between the two. While economic planning and interference were formerly taboo, they are now deemed necessary. A duty in the face of competition from the other superpowers. That's interesting. I get the sense that now America's arguably a bit more left-wing, at least in the economic sense, because it's not full-blown American capitalist. Possibly. Maybe I'm reading a bit too much into that, but it's interesting to think. Anyway, while Eisenhower took little interest in domestic affairs, his focus on combating defeatism and reshaping America's place in the world. Having inherited the Siberian War from Dewey, Ike committed to expanding America's presence in the region to restore American pride abroad. 1,000 troops were entered the tundra to prop up the otherwise faltering Yagoda regime, developing infrastructure, rooting out dissidents and bandit groups, and facilitating another, much larger wave of immigration across the Pacific. The new administration would not take long to face the same trouble as the previous administration. Soon, the ever-increasing effort to tread water would provide isolationist forces with new ammunition against the increasingly controversial war. One benefit of the Siberian War would be the United Nations Compact of 1949, which created the Organization of Free Nations, a military alliance that swore collective defense among the remaining nations in the former United Nations. While isolationist elements protested heavily the Compact's circumvention of Congress's traditional role in declaring war, Eisenhower's treaty was immediately popular with the public, spelling the death of isolationism for the foreseeable future. Eisenhower remember it as the most outstanding achievement of his tenure. So, here we have the UN Compact of 49. Despite America's loss during the Second World War and the rise of isolationism at home, the beating heart and dream of international liberalism never ceased to beat in Washington. The 49 UN Compact sought to preserve liberalism worldwide by establishing the OFN, a permanent military alliance among the United States' remaining allies. The alliance's commitment to collective defense circumvents Congress's right to declare war by putting it in the hands of the OFN, a development that sparked some initial opposition from President Dewey and certain conservative members of the government. Still, most Americans back the OFN on all fronts. From Democrat to Republican to soldier to citizen, Lady Liberty and her allies stand ready to ensure the torch of liberty shines on for generations to come. So, here's the faction. It looks like we're getting rid of the old blue focus. And here we have the President of the Military Committee and Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. The Military Committee of the OFN acts as the alliance's sword, responsible for coordinating the collective military's knowledge of all of its member states, to deliver recommendations to its Security Council. The committee president is the kingmaker for actioning these recommendations, being the body's most senior officer, and chief rules maker. Without exception, this position is and always will be occupied by an American. Well, there we go. The Eisenhower years will also be remembered as a formulation of the U.S.'s sense of nuclear optimism, viewing the possession and development of an overwhelmingly powerful nuclear arsenal as a key part in rolling back fascist power worldwide. Nuclear weapons were an existential threat, but they remained conceptual, hypothetical, unparalleled strategic advance whose power had no limit. Had they been ready in time, nuclear weapons could have saved Britain, liberated Asia and Europe, and ensured world peace under democratic values. Eisenhower may not have had the bombs then, but he had it now, in large quantities with payloads multitudes larger than those tested at Los Alamos, ready for the final confrontation with fascism. On weekends, families from LA drove down into the Nevada desert to witness the blinding manifestation of the American superpower, awestruck and unthinking what such a device could do to human beings. That's interesting. Yeah, I guess. So I guess they dropped the A-bomb being dropped on Hawaii. Which makes sense, because I don't think Japan would get the A-bomb before the Americans. And then, yeah, I guess there wouldn't be a necessity to use the A-bomb after. Does that mean, because I know depending on how long the war in Ukraine goes, Germany can use the A-bomb and drop it on Kyiv. Would that be the first documented usage of an atomic bomb dropped in war and a wartime condition or wartime setting? Because that would be crazy, actually. All things I'm musing about openly. I'll stop musing and keep going. Another oddity of the Eisenhower years were the codification of split national intelligence services in the form of the FBI's Special Intelligence Service and the Eisenhower-era construction of the Central Intelligence Agency. Despite the latter's name, the two organizations operate independently in different areas of the world. The SIS conducted operations in North and South America, as it had since the 1930s, and the CIA operated elsewhere in the world. The former prioritized intelligence gathering and political influencing, while the latter, at least initially, had carte blanche to uphold American interests in a variety of ways. While zones of operation were delineated in 1949, this did not stop the CIA from arming rebels in Central America and South America. And since its inception, the agency has been in near constant conflict with the SIS. Both the SIS and the CIA saw action in the 1949 diplomatic crisis between Uruguay and Argentina. More overtly in Central America when the CIA and SIS backed El Salvador and Honduras, respectively, during multiple failed attempts to assassinate Rafael Trujillo. In support for Eisenhower's gunboat diplomacy to try and dispose of the Ecuadorian government and protect the American elites on the Galapagos Islands. In the cinders of Taft's record-breaking defeat came a new generation of Republicans, including a particularly fated representative from suburban Los Angeles, Richard Nixon. A Navy veteran and ambitious young politician was eager to prove himself against the new Democratic consensus that seemed more fragile with each passing day. Keenly interested in foreign policy and hunting for an angle, Nixon's instincts told him that Taft's steadfast isolationism had become politically toxic in the wake of the Second World War. Instead, he hopped on board the rising neo-continentalist school of thought, arguing that the expedition to Siberia was a dereliction of duty when the American supercontinent itself harbored anti-American nations backed by fascist powers abroad. By expertly playing on American fears of further defeat, Tricky Dick catapulted himself into an open Senate seat, in the forefront of a reinvigorated generation of Republicans set to take power in the future, even while they remained outside of the government in the present. Eisenhower spent much of his first term preparing for a foreign policy confrontation, but would instead find his mettle tested in tropical Hawaii. Tensions between the dominant Big Five corporations and the island's labor unions boiled into a strike wave in '51, bringing the island's economy to a standstill. For a moment, it appeared that the crushing hold of the corporations was on the verge of shattering. Instead, the tide receded. A multi-pronged attack from the Big Five through latent racial resentment, FBI involvement, government ordered arrest of union leadership, and the formation of company unions, which took lesser deals than their independent counterparts, robbed the ILWU of its momentum, and brought the strike to a catastrophic close. The Eisenhower government, unlike the Roosevelt era, opted to observe as the corporations reestablished their control passively, another decision that would leave liberals fuming as the president ignored their cause celebre from their party. The final straw for Democratic liberals' toleration of Eisenhower came in the field of civil rights. New Deal funding and state building transformed southern states from one-party Herrenvolk democracies into domestic fascist republics, with the racial order upheld by state-funded paramilitaries loyal only to the governor. The rule of law did not apply here, only the interest of those in power. Disappearances were common, bad press meant brutal ends, and open activism was exceedingly rare. All of which was allowed because it kept the Democratic coalition in power. Organized black activists brought the case of lynchings and racial violence to a national stage, but it seldom became a national issue. Senator and former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, a champion of the civil rights movement since her time in the White House, despite her husband's indifference. This advocacy only grew with her election to the Senate. Her activism went above and beyond, in forcing the issue into white circles, driving a wedge between newly convinced Northern Democrats and their uneasy Southern counterparts. When Hawaii violence was beamed into American television screens, showing a distinct racial divide between striker and strike breaker, conversation started. Soon, pressure from beyond the Roosevelt caucus began more openly to call on the president to do something. Eisenhower again demurred, adding one more disappointment that would cement his first term as a failure in the eyes of those remaining Roosevelt Democrats. Race in the U.S. was simply not an issue worth Eisenhower's time. Issues of economy, of defense, and the federal government were much more concrete and less divisive in the American political society. In ignoring the civil rights question, Eisenhower may have hoped that the issue would eventually recede in its own time. He could not have been more wrong. Matters only escalated Southern segregation as governments leaped to defend the so-called Southern way of life. Eisenhower did not pass the Civil Rights Bill, nor were there any executive orders issued, but it was as though black activists and their liberal allies had fired a starting pistol. The white backlash was immediate and allowed men like Herman Talmadge, Orville Faubus, and Strom Thurmond to enter office on the platform of escalating their usage of states' powers against a perceived existential threat. Oh, Ike. There's a lot more not to like in this timeline, isn't there? In the shadow of these concurrent crises, the 52 presidential election came and went almost dreamlike. Eisenhower, entering his 60s and still popular despite an idle first term, saw no need to actively campaign and focused primarily on shoring up American efforts abroad. Siberia, Haiti, Latin America, and beyond saw renewed American economic and military investment. Furthermore, activities of the FBI's Special Intelligence Services targeted perceived hostile regimes across the Americas and agitated to secure the U.S.'s hegemony there. Republicans found the sacrificial lamb in Ed Martin, a Pennsylvania governor turned senator in his 60s, who would take the nomination by default as a half-hearted Republican Ike, banking on his credentials as an officer on the home front during World War II. His selection of running mate would carry more intrigue. Initially, the young Senator Dick Nixon seemed to be an invigorating choice, but concerns over corruption and crudity handed the nomination to Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. instead. Choosing a wealthy dynastical Eastern establishment heir over the upstart from Whittier was a surprise that left Nixon seething for a chance at redemption. While Republicans would again face certain defeat in November, Richard Nixon, embittered by Martin's snub, desperately sought his revenge. So here's the victory, the margins of victory. A lot less impressive. A lot of these plain states, Oregon, Idaho, most of New England, with exception of Rhode Island. As well as 3 of these, at the time, Steel Belt states. Here we have the campaigns. I like how their slogan is "Think about it." They know you're not gonna. Martin and Lodge know you're not gonna vote for him, but just think about it. You know. That's kind of funny to me. Henry Cavill Law Jr. Interesting that he's having more prominence here. And let's move on. Eisenhower's second term would serve as reheated leftovers of his first. Beyond the limited personal interests that Ark harbored, such as infrastructure concerns and foreign affairs, stagnation and complacency would become the watchword of the early 50s. Once again, Ike would enter his term with supermajorities in both chambers of Congress. Once again, the general felt little interest in obeying his party's priorities. Once again, liberal partisans would find themselves entirely frustrated by the enormous opportunities passing the president by, but this time they found the resolve to force Eisenhower's hand. The battle over civil rights had only grown more intense with time, and much to the president's displeasure, he would not act first. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the plaintiffs in United States versus Knox County Schools, and outlawed public funds for segregated institutions. In the face of a new law of the land, enforceable only by an unwilling executive, the southern states simply ignored the proclamation. It would be the start of a constitutional crisis more resembling an insurgency than a pitched battle. Northern congressional liberals came to draft a bill to establish a civil rights commission to investigate violations of Reconstruction amendments. However, the watered-down bill made it to the floor was powerless. Eager to end the civil rights controversy, Eisenhower signed the act into law only to further inflame the situation. The bill's weakness and lack of enforcement outraged activists, and white Southerners rejected the right of federal legislators to regulate race relations in their states. Eisenhower declared the battle won and ignored the issue, but tensions furthered. Militancy sweltered, and another confrontation loomed. So here's the Civil Rights Act of 54. Reconstruction failed to resolve the issue of racial inequality despite calls for the protection of all citizens in their civil and legal rights. By the mid-century, this status quo had become untenable. Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 54 under President Eisenhower. The first since 1875, it established a federal civil rights commission to investigate gross violations of civil rights across the country. Yet, this commission has seen itself battered, abused, and weakened by successive state and local institutions. Tensions between the federal government and segregated institutions were at an all-time high. The Supreme Court ultimately ruled in favor of civil rights in U.S. versus Knox, prohibiting government funding for segregated schools. Not fun stuff to talk about. History would remember Ike as a popular man with little interest or initiatives in governments. Sitting on supermajorities in both houses of Congress, he wasted a golden opportunity to rebuild the nation in his image. Many liberals would never forgive him for it or stop dreaming of what could have been. And as they looked to 56, they wondered if it could be again. President Eisenhower could not have been more disinterested in who Democrats would crown as his chosen successor. The news that B.P. Lucas, already on poor terms after yielding his responsibilities during the 52 campaign, would not seek the nomination was more reason for excitement among the keymakers in the Democratic Party. While it would be wrong to look at Eisenhower's presidency as an explicit failure from the lens of the machine whose lifeblood hinges on the size of a Democratic majority, you'd struggle to find another phrase that so acutely describes their feelings. Shit, so Eisenhower's much better. I talked about... What did I talk about? There's mentions of highways. His insistence to start fighting the Cold War, build up domestic infrastructure, work on the economy. Probably not too much different from what he did in our timeline. He'd probably lie somewhere in the middle. Maybe lower middle, if I had to guesstimate. Anyhow. Antipathy from the White House at the electoral process saw local partisan infrastructure wither away throughout Eisenhower's presidency. In each election where the president's name wasn't on the ballot, Democrats suffered crippling losses. Fearing the loss of the presidency in November, the 56 Democratic candidates represented a diverse range of ideals, catering to the many factions of the party who they felt they'd been left behind. Most notable among them was Senate Majority Whip Lyndon Johnson of Texas, who emerged as an early favorite due to his public oratory and private ability to appease all factions. But a major heart attack abruptly ended Johnson's presidential run and again opened the field, again exciting the disparate representatives of the Democratic Party's many factions. So this leads to Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee, who seemed like a long-shot choice before Johnson's heart attack, but by spring '56, his name recognition began to soar. His campaign connected with the people using the new medium of television. advertising his prior escapades against corruption to public adoration and announcing cronyism to the charge in party leaks. A notable and consequential exception would be former Ambassador Joseph P. Kennedy, who had long ago substituted his presidential ambitions with those of his sons. The death of his eldest son, Joseph Jr., and the defense of Britain only aided in his family's mythos, which seemed incredibly attractive to Kefauver, who spent the war years in politics. Kennedy offered to financially support Kefauver's bid for the White House and rebuild support with party elites in exchange for placing his son, John Kennedy, in the number 2 slot for the ticket. This false choice was a no-brainer for Kefauver, who needed this inroad not just for the nomination, but a serious chance at uniting the Democratic Party. Another 8 years out of the White House had done the Republican Party a favor in hindsight. Replenishing their ranks after back-to-back wipeouts following the war, the party suffered 2 of the greatest defeats in generations, looked formidable to take back Washington. This time, Wisconsin Senator Alexander Wiley, a strong conservative internationalist voice, rose to be the Republicans' champion in '56 and promised a new approach to tackling the presidency in a post-Eisenhower era. The campaign between Kefauver and Wiley would be the most lively since the 1940 showdown between Dewey and Hopkins, both candidates touring the country and taking the attack to one another. For Wiley, Republicans saw a chance to paint their losses at the hands of Roosevelt and Eisenhower as mere flukes, showing the Democrats couldn't win without another strong personality at the head of the ticket. For Kefauver's ability to entice liberals and Southerners alike, after mutual betrayals, potentially brought opposites together for the last time. Yeah, that's a very interesting map. You have a pretty solid South for the Democrats. You have a fair bit of the old Democratic firewall up here: New York, Mass, California, Nevada, and almost everything else going red. 327 to 181 to 29. Not a bad margin at all. But when you compare it to this, still not bad, but it's not showing it. I will vote for Kefauver and Kennedy. That's simple one. Meanwhile, we have Alexander Wiley and then Prescott Bush. Alexander Wiley, I couldn't really find much other than the fact that, very interestingly, the man who succeeded in the Senate was named Gaylord Nelson. And I point this out because I have the humor of a teenager. And his name is a little unfortunate if you have the humor of a teenager. And then we have Prescott Bush. Daddy of H.W. Bush, granddaddy of W. No matter where we go, we can't escape the Bushes in a mango-related product, evidently. In the end, after a close race, Kefauver and Kennedy emerged victorious. Now forced to govern, Kefauver can no longer wear different faces to party factions. We need to lead decisively, even when offending critical allies. Being the first Southerner to take the office in nearly a century, there were plenty of reasons to fear yet another betrayal of liberals in the party. While strange bedfellows brought Kefauver to the White House, they had no intention of keeping him there if he got out of line. The existentialism on both sides of the party was reaching a boiling point. His political survival necessitated action that he couldn't deliver upon. He couldn't legislate to appease the activists in the party, and he couldn't hold off mass revolts in the South. Even his bread and butter, such as directing the DOJ to investigate executive and state corruption, became polluted by issues of the day and provoked internal dissent. Kefauver, too, refused to enforce a 54 decision mandating an end to public funds for segregated institutions, drawing the ire of liberals. Drafts of economic bills sank, labor unions resented his prosecutorial activism. Kefauver's free hand with executive power only frustrated his administrative divisions. Among his early successes were Kefauver's early use of radio and television airwaves. Much like how he connected with the public in his early career, he would attempt to rationalize what decision-making he could do to the wider country and bypass enemies in Congress. Circumventing national media and repulsed by his lowbrow politics, Kefauver managed to temporarily dull the knives of the activist, organized labor, and the conservative South, and allowed the president to sequester otherwise controversial issues through the arena of public opinion. The first employment of telecommunications occurred early in his presidency when Eisenhower's gunplay diplomacy against Ecuador, just days before leaving office, toppled the Quito government and maintained American control over the Galapagos Islands. Kefauver spoke to the American people and promised a new direction for the U.S.'s foreign policy. There was no other way he could get the public behind a pardon of Gus Hall, the General Secretary of the Communist Party, for still pending charges of delinquency in Hawaii. Instead of him fostering domestic extremism, like the press lambasted him, Kefauver appeared to individual liberties and justice for all. Kefauver discovered another America beyond Capitol Hill that heard, understood, and even accepted him, emboldening his confidence as a nuclearly modern, powerful hubris. This hubris would be his undoing. Kefauver would discover the limits of his charm when setting off to stabilize the world's balance of powers, venturing to divide the former Axis powers between the revolutionary extremist power of Nazi Germany and the comparatively stable and reliable Empire of Japan. World War II had ended without a peace treaty, and much of the world's borders were a status quo that could shatter given a sufficiently powerful crisis. With that goal in mind, the majority faction of the Kefauver foreign policy establishment opened talks with the Japanese in neutral Mexico City, where the U.S. and Japan agreed to reduce trade barriers, mutual recognition of post-war territorial arrangements, and the U.S. would purchase Japanese gold to establish a consistent exchange between the two currencies. Ahead of ratification, Kefauver used his power to authorize the purchase of gold, withdraw tariffs, and begin preparing the State Department to establish relations with Indonesia, China, Manchuria, and other members of Japanese sphere of influence. This unprecedented deal between the two superpowers would produce a short-lived victory that, for its ambitions, faced immutable criticism in both houses of Congress and both major political parties. Conservatives opposed reconciliation with Japanese, whose expansionism had taken hundreds of thousands of American lives and so threatened the United States, as it organized labor, which feared liberalized trade with Japan would force American workers to compete with slave labor. All factions were united in opposing the threat to American pride and legalizing American defeat on the battlefield. Even the internationalists who had previously backed Kefauver opposed the treaty, which many said would put the Republic of India in a dangerous position where the United States will not be able to support their ally in case of invasion by the Calcutta government. Unlike the Democratic dream of re-winning the Second World War, the U.S.-Japan treaty died in the Senate, making further approachment of Tokyo impossible. Conservatives solidified their rejection of Kefauver as a result of this blunder, as did organized labor, which lobbied legislators to oppose further Kefauver efforts. International liberals adopted a policy supporting human rights and democratic values backed by force of arms over diplomacy with authoritarian governments. I'm trying to make sense of this. I can understand the economic ties in theory to reduce the crisis, but against Imperial Japan, I don't buy it. This seems a little, I'm not going to say it's quite a jump the shark moment, but I don't know if I fully buy into this, personally. Well, let's keep reading. Kefauver's political shortcomings would only be exposed further by his ambivalence on civil rights. While the movement would capture the attention of the country as the decade progressed, there was no louder voice in the halls of Congress for the movement than Senator Eleanor Roosevelt's. Understanding the issue as a referendum on the Democratic Party's stance on human rights, she knew just as well as her Southern counterparts that the issue necessitated action, one way or the other. Kefauver, as a Southerner first and a liberal second, was never going to be the man for the job. Cowardice left Kefauver to desperation, to Kennedy. Vice President John Kennedy did not identify with the civil rights movement, hoping one day to take the presidency with a critical backing of Southern Democrats. Still, amid the Kefauver administration's implosion over the Pacific Treaty and a general party revolt against the president, the 64 hopeful from Massachusetts sought a pragmatic course. Kennedy swallowed his pride and fears of political reprisal to co-offer a new comprehensive Civil Rights Act alongside Senator Roosevelt and Senator Hubert Humphrey from Minnesota, which Kennedy was sure could not possibly make it to a vote. It remained that way, unsubmitted, resubmitted, tabled, unpassable for years, well past the crisis of the Kefauver presidency and into the next administration. Despite being out of power for almost 12 years, Republicans did not curl up and die as many pundits had predicted or hoped. They just got hungrier. The GOP and its stalwarts rejected the narrative being built by Democrats that the government is a necessity in common life, that every man is owed a job or inherently deserves their necessities, instead believing the sacred tenets of individual liberty and the necessity of struggle for the human soul. Perhaps no other candidate related to the struggle more than Richard Nixon, who doubted, beaten, tested, and suppressed, kept advancing despite the odds against him. While Democrat victories annihilated party elders and one-time colleagues, Nixon remained steadfast, winning first his House race in 48, the Senate in 50, and then the California state governorship in 54, avoiding the ill-fated 52 and 56 vice presidential spots, and finally emerging as the GOP's undisputed frontrunner. A former representative of Senator, Nixon knew the fight. His politics were cool, calculated, and optimized for the most results with the least outrage. Party elites who doubted him as an abuser of campaign finance or a single-issue red baiter were either pushed out of politics or soon came to appreciate his uniqueness, the necessity of giving him a shot at a national ticket. Would he be a red baiter or a gray baiter? I read he was worried more about fascists. So I don't know if red baiter, unless they're talking about like red meat bait, I don't know. Anyway. Like Dewey in 1940, Nixon was young and spirited, now appealing to most sections of the Republican Party, promised a departure from losing attitudes of those who came before. Democrats, by contrast, faced calamity in 1960, and most partisans knew it. President Kefauver's lack of a domestic agenda and inaction on civil rights divided all sections of the party. His foreign adventures with Japan and the fantastical visions of a world forum convinced many of 56's skeptics that change was due. Even as the element broadcast on television or seed by the radio, Kefauver's star was falling, and no allies were eager to save him. The calculus of backing Roosevelt's Civil Rights Act, but not allowing it to pass, kept much of Kennedy's image with liberals and Southerners alike intact. But the VP was not eager to lend his credibility to his sinking administration. 64 would be Kennedy's year, with or without an incumbent Kefauver. Under these conditions, amid this house divided, the solid South began to crack. Kefauver's re-election would not come by Southern obligation, but through the modernization of liberals, who would only come with a strong commitment to civil rights. The 1960 presidential election would almost certainly be a definitive showdown between the two camps. And when liberals, led by Senator Humphrey, managed to force a strong civil rights plank onto Kefauver, the South blinked. Delegates from Deep South have bolted at shifting elector states towards the deeply conservative Ross Barnett, or an act of unprecedented ancestral betrayal, considering inroads with the Republicans. Nixon never spoke a word favoring segregation, but nods and allusions were enough to show what a better deal looked like. And this is what that led to. A hung election. Barnett holding the Deep South that Goldwater would win in our timeline in 54. Kefauver winning a couple of the border states, losing a lot of support. He actually picked up support in New England with Connecticut. What the fuck, Connecticut? Losing a lot of Western support. Yeah. Interesting. And then we have this. The same goofy-ass campaign slogan. And this one's just their names. Andrew Schopel. Let me pull up who this is. Governor of Kansas and a U.S. Senator from Kansas. Okay. Boring, generic Republican guy. Inoffensive Republican guy. For this mistake, Kefauver paid the ultimate price. Barnett's conservative electors prevented either Kefauver or Nixon from achieving an outright majority in the Electoral College. Perhaps Kefauver could have saved his re-election from the brink by announcing the Roosevelt bill, repudiating the 60 party plank, and issuing promises to the contested delegations, but for whatever reason, he did not. Instead, electors handed the results of the 1960 to the House of Reps for the state delegations to decide, and facing an intransigent Democratic, ostensibly committed to civil rights, and Republican who had no firm commitment to anything, the House handed Nixon the presidency, while the Democratic majority Senate re-elected Kennedy as vice president. So it was, on January 20th, 1961, a regime neither Democratic nor Republican, unsatisfying to its core. It was, however, undeniably something different. And that is the lower portion of the Dev Diary. I'm going to take a quick little gander. I believe most of this pops up later on. But this is the starting conditions for the U.S. when this new update ends up popping out. So we only have, looking at the pie chart, we have three factions here. It kind of looks like a color inverted version of the Filipino flag, an all blue version. You have Republicans led by Nixon at the start, Democrats led by Kefauver, and Independents led by John Q. Public. I believe these guys are gone into more in the next video, so I'm just going to leave that for the next video. And you'll notice that America starts off with Hawaii, a couple, Aleutian Islands read it out, and America now starts with Hawaii in the start date when this update comes out. Very, very interesting. So the lore seems pretty interesting. I do like... Oh, there's a big elf in the room, and that the NPP is gone. I thought the idea of the NPP was fun and chaotic, but I was never married to it. So if they wanted to cut it, so be it. If they wanted to make room for a more interesting lore. So far, I'm not convinced it was necessary to cut it. I don't know if I hate it being cut. I don't mind one way or the other. Also, isn't this the on Richard Nixon 1960? Nixon still had more of his hair. Oh, a little bit more of his hair. Just trying to compare this photo to that one. That's a little bit more thin there. They're not doing Tricky Dick any favors with that, are they? But that's it for part 2 of the Dev Diary. I'll be back tomorrow when we get into the gameplay. By the time that tomorrow comes around, I'll have read the comments for part 1 as well as part 2. More than likely. So you guys still have... I still have some time to leave some comments if you want to give me any feedback on how to do these. I'd appreciate it. In the meanwhile, I'm going to leave things there. Thanks always for watching, gang. Like if you liked, dislike if you didn't. Check out my links in the description box below. Check out my different series. I've done a lot of Tino stuff, a lot of Hearts of Iron 4 stuff in general, a lot of new campaign trail stuff, and some odd stuff here and there. If you're interested in any of that, go ahead and check out my channel. But until next time, I will see you all in the next video. Thanks for watching, and bye-bye.